Good day. Today's video, like all my videos, or the great majority of my videos this year, focus on the topic of the Ukraine conflict. And as I said in the past, I make no apology for this. This conflict is being waged in Ukraine, it's being waged in Europe. Lots of things are taking place around the world that are independent of it. There is a continued crisis, for example, in the Horn of Africa, in Ethiopia, where it's now becoming increasingly clear that the civil war there between the Ethiopian government and the Tigrayan insurgency has a geopolitical dimension, with the Ethiopian government increasingly tilting towards China and Russia, and the Tigrayans, to a greater or lesser extent, looking to the West. So that's one major crisis that's taking place. And of course, we've just had an important election in Brazil, which I and my colleague, Alex Christoforou, discussed in a program which we've just done on the Duran, and in which the veteran left-wing politician Lula da Silva has been elected again president of Brazil. He was president of Brazil previously, and now he's again become president in a nail-biting and extremely tight election in which he just managed to defeat his opponent, Jair Bolsonaro. Now, briefly on that topic, and as we discussed in our program on the Duran, Lula, who is a founder member of the BRICS group, will, in my opinion, continue to be an active and loyal member of that group, as I suspect Bolsonaro would have done if he had been elected as well. Brazilian foreign policy, it seems to me, has now found a kind of internal stability and consistency, very different from what was the case during the Cold War, when leftists in Brazil, as in the rest of South America, took a somewhat anti-American position from time to time, and sometimes quietly tilted towards the Soviet Union, whereas conservatives, including of course the right-wing leaders right-wing military leaders who launched the coup that took power in Brazil in 1964, and which maintained Brazil as a military dictatorship until 1985, right-wing leaders were of course firmly aligned with the United States and against the Soviet and communist enemy. Well, today Brazil, for all its major, very considerable internal problems, is looking increasingly like an emerging great power, perhaps not as far up that road as, say, India is, but one can already see that it's developing the kind of foreign policy which one might expect of a great power, and that makes it more distant from Washington and, in fact, more willing to make its own independent decisions and to base its decisions on its own perceptions of its national interests, rather than to align itself with ideological and geopolitical camps. And that looks like it's now a stable course that Brazil will follow, irrespective of the political orientation of the president. But talking about Brazil in that way brings me back, of course, to the Ukrainian crisis, because when we talk about Brazil conducting an independent foreign policy, maintaining a greater distance from the United States, at this moment, above all, that relates to Brazil's policies with respect to the Ukrainian crisis. And Brazil, under Bolsonaro's government, tended, if anything, to tilt slightly towards Russia in its political orientations. It abstained in the Security Council meeting a few weeks ago, where the United States tried to get the Security Council to pass, or at least to pass a resolution critical of Russia's annexation of the 4 regions. Brazil did then tilt slightly back towards the United States in the General Assembly, where it actually voted for a very similar resolution, again proposed by the United States and its allies. But in some ways it was the abstention that was more telling, and the overall impression one gets is of a Brazil which does not want to be seen following Washington's orders, which is loyal to its partners in the BRICS group, and which wants to preserve its good relations with China and Russia, which are increasingly important economically for Brazil as well. So that, as I said, talking about Brazil brings us back to the Ukrainian crisis, because Lula gives every indication of wanting to continue that policy. So no possibility, for example, as far as I can see, of Brazil supplying or selling weapons to Ukraine. This despite the fact that Brazil has a significant military-industrial complex, and no prospect either of Brazil joining the US and EU sanctions war, the economic war against Russia either. So, in a sense, talking about Brazil, talking about the election there, inexorably brings us back to the Ukrainian conflict. And that is why, in spite of the fact that, as I said, this is a conflict in Europe, I constantly find myself talking about it. It's not because things are not happening elsewhere in the world. Rather, it is because Ukraine has become the main arena of conflict between the great powers at the moment, and that means that the entire international system is aligning itself around it. So, what is happening in Ukraine? Well, the big news yesterday, obviously, was the Russian missile strikes, which have been described as the most devastating up to now, the ones that have done the most critical damage. And apparently, there was a meeting of the Ukrainian government yesterday in which their results were described as catastrophic. There was also, incidentally, apparently, a report given to this at this government session. I haven't seen it, and this may be rumor, but it seems like it's probably true. Anyway, there was a report given to the government which basically apparently said if Russia sustains this offensive on this kind of scale for 40 more days, then the entire energy system will collapse. The country will be, in effect, fragmented into pockets where there is still some electric power and vast areas where there is none. It will no longer be possible to provide basic services in the cities, and there might even have to be serious thought given to evacuating the cities, given that it would not be possible to keep the civilian population in the cities supplied and warm during the winter. I have to say that is a genuinely catastrophic outcome. I hope it turns out that we can find some way that we never get there. But that gives one, I think, a sense of how devastating these missile strikes on Ukraine yesterday were. And what makes it particularly interesting is that, as far as I can see, this was not the biggest attack. Apparently, around 50 missiles were launched. These are Ukrainian figures. The Ukrainians claim to have shot down 44 of them, but I don't think anybody takes that seriously. It's not possible to carry out the massive damage that we saw done yesterday with just 6 missiles. And as I discussed yesterday, even Ukraine admits that many more targets were hit than would have been possible with just 6 missiles. I would say that this was a classic example of where Ukraine got its wartime propaganda scrambled with, I suspect, very damaging effect on the civilian population, pretending that 44 out of 50 missiles were shot down when most of the country is subjected to the aftershocks of this massive attack, can only have made Ukrainians skeptical about the truth of what their government is telling them. So I think this is a major misstep, a significant blunder in what has, in truth, up to now, been a relatively slick media campaign, propaganda campaign that Ukraine's government has been conducting since the war began. But anyway, the fact is, if it was indeed 50 missiles, as has been suggested, then almost certainly it was not the biggest missile strike of all. The biggest missile strike, as far as I can tell, judging by the sheer number of missiles launched, was the one that took place earlier in October, directly after the bomb attack on the Crimean Bridge. And that apparently may have involved, well, some reports say up to 100 missiles. Probably it was less than that, but probably it was more than 50. Now, of course, these are Ukrainian figures. The Russians don't tell us how many missiles they launch on any particular day. And of course, it wasn't just yesterday, because as I looked at the news in preparation for making this video, well, I saw maps of Ukraine showing where air raid warnings are being transmitted, and the entirety of Ukraine is now, every region of Ukraine is apparently affected by air raid warnings. And it looks as if there's been more missile strikes over the course of this morning. And of course, as is now regularly the case, these missile strikes are accompanied by geranium-2 drone attacks. Now, the geranium drones I've discussed at inordinate length, these relatively small things made from carbon fiber and plastic with small motors, allegedly and indeed probably developed by Iran, either supplied directly by Iran to Russia or more probably made by Russia on the basis of an Iranian license. And it's been discussed on numerous occasions. These aren't really drones exactly, since they follow a pre-programmed course with apparently GPS or GLONASS corrections. GLONASS is the Russian system that is the Russian equivalent of GPS, whatever. These drones are perhaps better understood as very simple, very cheap, propeller-driven cruise missiles. And again, it's difficult to say exactly how many of these are used at any one particular time. I think Zelensky a day or so ago claimed that Russia has launched around 400 of these things in total against Ukraine since the missile offensive began. But, you know, however many it was, once more, one is getting information that they're doing significant damage. And quite likely, very plausibly, the missile strikes this morning aren't just geranium-2 drone strikes. They're also strikes involving heavier missiles. And whilst I'm on the topic of heavy missiles, yesterday, the media in the West, in Ukraine, indeed on Russian channels as well, was buzzing with reports that the MiG29 fighter jets that Russia has deployed to Belarus are now armed with Kinjal hypersonic missiles. And there's much speculation about whether these missiles are also going to be used in some way in support of this missile offensive, or whether they're there as some sort of deterrent to the West in case of a Western attack on Belarus, or perhaps more plausibly, some kind of attempt by the West to stage some kind of operation in the Baltic Sea. Anyway, whatever, the fact is that these MiG-31 fighter jets are deployed in Belarus, and by the way, they have actually played a real active role in the fighting. Now, I've described in the past about how Ukraine, which is struggling to come up with a effective response to the Uranium-2 drones, using an expensive S-300 missile. This is a big surface-to-air missile, of which Ukraine, by the way, has only a finite supply. To shoot down one of these relatively small, plasticky, propeller-driven things is a massive disproportion of resources and will deplete Ukrainian air defenses very rapidly. Well, the Ukrainians have somewhat incredibly been using their few remaining fighter jets in an effort to shoot these drones down. And there's been reports of MiG-29 and even Sukhoi-27 fighter jets of the Ukrainian Air Force trying to hunt down and shoot down Uranium-2 drones, which, by the way, I doubt is particularly easy. I mean, it's probably quite a hard job to track these things with an aircraft radar, and given that they operate at very different speeds from fighter jets, it's probably not entirely easy for the fighter jets to maneuver around them. And of course, the air-to-air missiles and the cannons that the Ukrainian fighter jets carry are probably not particularly well adapted to shooting down these things. And of course, using fighter jets to shoot down, again, cheap, plasticky drones is a massive, disproportionate use of resources. It's a completely misconceived use of resources. It's certainly not cost effective, but at least, unlike the S-300s, the fighter jets are not expended away shooting down something very small and very light and very cheap. You lose an expensive missile by doing it. Well, you're spending a disproportionate sum of money using a fighter jet to do it, but you're not losing the fighter jet. Except, of course, it turns out that you might. Now, there was a very weird event a few weeks ago in which a MiG-29 shot down a Uranium-2 drone, which then broke up and damaged the MiG-29 fighter jet, causing the MiG-29 fighter jet itself to crash. So, I mean, there was that rather odd and incident which must be put down to chance. But there have been other incidents, and they are of a sort which I would have thought are much more concerning for Ukraine, because the MiG-31 fighter jets that Russia has deployed in Belarus have enormous radars, and they are probably also operating alongside Russia's AWACS equivalent, the A-50 mainstay. Mainstay is what NATO calls it. The Russians call it something else, but anyway, it's the Russian equivalent of the AWACS. And of course, they're able to keep track on what the Ukrainian fighters are doing. And the MiG-31s are able to launch, or have launched, ultra-long distance air-to-air missiles against some of these fighter jets. These Ukrainian fighter jets chasing these Uranium-2 drone missiles. And there have been reports now, reports I cannot confirm, but which do seem plausible, that at least 2 Ukrainian fighter jets have been shot down by these MiG-31s operating within Belarus's airspace. They were able to launch these ultra-long-range air-to-air missiles, which can cover distances of hundreds of kilometers. Obviously, these missiles are provided with course correction from the fighter jet itself, and anyway, one way or the other, the MiG-31 itself, but one way or the other, they have apparently successfully intercepted and destroyed Ukrainian fighter jets. So it's not a cost-free strategy for Ukraine by any means to try to destroy these fighter jets, these drones in this kind of fashion. They are simply setting up their own air force, which is now limited in number. They're setting it up as targets for these very long-range interceptions carried out by the MiG-31s in Belarus. And of course, if the MiG-31s in Belarus are also equipped with Kinjal missiles, then it's a question about what those Kinjal missiles might be used for. Now, I ought to say that this is a particularly hot topic in the West, the Kinjal, because one of the claims that has been made in the West is that the Russians only have 75 Kinjal missiles in total, because supposedly they can't get advanced microchips to develop and build Kinjal missiles. Now, I'm going to say straight away that once more, I think that there is no truth to this claim. The Kinjal itself appears to be an adaptation of the very well-known and very well-established Iskander ballistic missile, medium-range ballistic missile, which the Russians have used in massive quantities in this conflict. And of course, that's a ground-launched system, but the Kinjal is an airborne adaptation of that missile. Now, no doubt there has been lots of changes made to the Kinjal, but it looks overall as if this was designed to be a relatively simple system, as hypersonic systems go. It's not as advanced, for example, as the Zircon sea-launched system. And I would have thought that the Russians have sorted out whatever manufacturing needs there are in order to produce it. I would have thought also that if the Russians can produce vast numbers of Iskander missiles, which they seem to be able to do, then they should have no problem building Kinjal missiles. But the fact is, these missiles are hypersonic, and what might they be used for if they are committed to some sort of role in Ukraine? Well, there's two possibilities that spring to my mind. Again, I'm not an expert in these things, but one would be to counter any advanced air defense systems Ukraine might get from the West. No air defense system that the West possesses is capable of intercepting a hypersonic missile. And if by chance, for example, the West were to decide to supply Ukraine with Patriot missiles, the Kinjal would be there in Belarus, ready to destroy the missile launchers, the Patriot missile launchers, and to counter these Patriot systems. And it could be, by the way, that part of the reason those MiG-31s with the Kinjals have been deployed to Belarus is to deter the United States from actually sending Patriot missiles to Ukraine. The United States might be concerned that if it did supply Ukraine with Patriot missiles and the Russians were to destroy it with its with their hypersonic missiles, that might not be, shall we say, to the credit of the Patriot system. Anyway, that's one possibility. Another possibility, which I will admit has occurred to me, and which I've touched on in the past, is that if the Russian offensive, which I expect will come later in the winter, if this, after the ground has hardened, if this offensive needs it, then conceivably those MiG-31s with those Kinjal missiles could be used to attack the Dnieper bridges, Ukraine's Dnieper bridges. If those bridges are destroyed, then Ukrainian forces east of the Dnieper are cut off from resupply, and Ukraine's problems would intensify massively. Especially, by the way, if at the same time the electricity system, the power generating system, were in a state of collapse. Anyway, that's just a possibility. I have discussed many times how difficult it is to destroy bridges, but I would have thought that Kinjal missiles, hypersonic and therefore possessing enormous kinetic striking force, power, quite apart from their explosives, perhaps combined with other missiles like the giant KH-22 and 32 missiles that the Russians have developed and which were originally designed to destroy aircraft carriers. I would have thought that a sustained offensive against the bridges using weapons like that, the Dnieper bridges using weapons like that, would probably destroy them. Probably it wouldn't happen immediately, but it could be done. Is that what the Russians intend to do? I don't know. I just float these possibilities. Anyway, massive missile offensive. It's having a devastating effect. It's ongoing. Ukraine doesn't seem to have an answer to it. And apparently, and by many accounts, there's already discussions about evacuating the cities, which, by the way, if that happens, then, to be frank, the effect on Ukraine would be devastating. And I'm not even going to touch on the humanitarian consequences. I spoke about that yesterday in my previous program. I would say, yet again, that if we get into a situation where entire cities have to be evacuated in this way, big cities like Kiev, Kharkiv presumably, and the others, well, I mean, that would be a catastrophe that hardly bears thinking about. But let's also consider one other byproduct of this missile offensive. I've discussed in the past, and others have discussed in the past, the British historian Adam Tooze wrote a good article about this some weeks ago, which I've discussed in another program, that one of the consequences of the war is that Ukraine's economy is spiraling down into what is increasingly looking like a hyperinflationary crisis. The Ukrainian central bank has already taken steps to restrict the conversion of the hryvnia into foreign currencies, which suggests that it's worried about the value of the hryvnia, the Ukrainian currency. And inflation in Ukraine has been rising, though it's been suppressed in some levels. I mean, apparently food prices have risen less fast than some other prices. But with the electricity system breaking down, with production having collapsed, with tax revenue having collapsed as well, and with the CEO of Naftogaz, Ukraine's national gas company, now warning that Ukraine doesn't have enough gas in reserve to get through the winter. Well, an implosion of the economy and a collapse of the budget obliges Ukraine increasingly to, in effect, print money, create money, in order to cover the cost of the war. And that's what it's been doing now for several months. It's been able to avoid the full consequences of this because of the massive financial assistance it's been getting from the West. If that financial assistance had not been provided, it's highly likely that Ukraine would already be in a state of hyperinflation by this point. But one does wonder how, at a time when the Western powers are themselves collapsing into recessions, one does wonder how much longer the West can sustain this kind of financial aid to Ukraine, especially as the demands that Ukraine is making are going to grow as the economy shrinks, as the electricity system collapses, as the energy system collapses, as tax revenue implodes. What does the West do? Does it just go on giving money to Ukraine? How much money is it prepared to give? How much money are Western taxpayers prepared to pay? Even if they give unlimited amounts of money, is that going to make any difference at the end of the day if there aren't goods being produced in the shops that people can buy with all this money that's being provided? And of course, if the electricity system breaks down and trains can't move goods around, then goods will be in increasing short supply, and sending money to Ukraine, trying to support the hryvnia in that way, actually increases the money supply at a time when there's a catastrophic absence of goods. And far from averting a hyperinflation crisis, one can see how that might actually, in some ways, produce it in a somewhat different way. So I've now been reading more and more articles about this. There was another article which I read just the other day, which also spoke about the fact that Ukraine is now very much at risk of hyperinflation. And once more, there doesn't seem to be any real answer to this except to throw more money at this problem. And meanwhile, the military situation on the battlefronts is now, I think, conclusively going against Ukraine. Now, if we talk about the place where Ukraine was looking, at least according to the media reports, to make its big breakthrough, which was Herson region, we've had a number of interesting reports coming out of Herson region over the last few hours. Firstly, the Russian authorities are evacuating another group of civilians from settlements west of the Dnieper River. It's all very curious that, from what one can tell, the Russians are moving troops west of the Dnieper at one and the same time as they ferry civilians across the Dnieper to the east. And this is giving many people uncertainties as to what exactly the Russian plans are. We're also seeing all sorts of other pictures now appearing. We see trainloads of pillboxes, concrete pillboxes, being transported apparently to Herson region. All the indications are that these pillboxes are being ferried across or transported across the Dnieper to Herson region across these pontoon bridges by the Russian military authorities, and they're being used to build ever stronger defense lines, including defense lines in a place called the Kinjal Spit, which is a promontory near Herson city itself, where there was some concerns a few weeks ago that Ukraine might be thinking of attempting an amphibious landing. And in fact, it did actually carry out a small amphibious landing there, though the Russians had no difficulty repelling it. So it looks like the Russians are fortifying Herson region and reinforcing in Herson region, even as they're clearing civilians from parts of Herson region. And one wonders what exactly is going on. Now, Ukraine has continued to launch attacks towards in Herson region, but the size of the forces committed has now dwindled. So whereas just a few weeks ago we were hearing about battalions being thrown into battle, even that, by the way, as I previously discussed, was relatively small numbers of forces in order, if the intention was to capture Herson city itself. But, we were hearing about reports of perhaps 1,000 men, plus armoured vehicles and tanks, attacking in one location after another. Over the last week or so, the numbers have dwindled further, and we're hearing about attacks happening at company level. That would be 100 or 200 men instead of the 1,000 plus that we were hearing about before. And we're getting, by the way, pictures now. I've seen film of a Ukrainian soldier trying to walk through the fields in Herson region, and one sees him struggling to move forward in what has now become a sea of mud. And obviously, it's the time of the autumn rains. I think that is now indisputable. So the ground has turned soft, but it looks as if the Russians might have been using the irrigation system, might have been taking steps with the irrigation system to actually increase the level of flooding, obstructing the Ukrainian advances even further. I wonder whether, by the way, one of the reasons why people are being evacuated, not so much from Herson city as from the surrounding settlements and villages, is precisely because the landscape is being reordered by the Russians for defensive purposes in this way. But what is the ultimate plan? Well, first of all, I think it is now becoming extremely unlikely, and that's perhaps an understatement, that Ukraine is going to be able to capture Herson city by the time of the midterms. Today is the 1st of November. The midterms are in a week's time. I mean, it would be, shall we say, a surprise if Ukraine was able to put together an offensive in Herson region, march all the way to the Dnieper, cut off the entire Russian military grouping west of the Dnieper, and storm Herson city over the space of a week. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it really doesn't look very likely, and it's looking less likely, as far as I can tell, by the day. If the Russians are building defences, if they're deploying more troops, if it is indeed the case that the number of Russian troops west of the Dnieper has doubled over the last few weeks, then I would have thought, realistically, the prospects of such an offensive succeeding are becoming increasingly doubtful. But again, perhaps one of the things you do if you're planning offensive operations, if you're going to deploy much of your army in an attack in some direction or another, is that you fortify your base area. And I can't help but think that this is partly what the Russians are doing. These build-ups of troops in Herson region look increasingly to me to have an offensive, ultimately offensive, as opposed to a merely defensive purpose. Well, we see, I've spoken previously how all sorts of indications, comments Putin made at the Vuhledar press conference, the Russian suspension of Russia's participation in the grain deal, all of this is starting increasingly to point to Russian interest once more in Nikolaev and Odessa, the two cities west of Herson city. And can I just, by the way, add that much of the focus of the missile attacks in recent days has been on Nikolaev, and of course, about a week ago, the mayor of Nikolaev actually urged all civilians to leave the city, suggesting that the Ukrainians themselves are starting to worry that an offensive might be launched in that direction. Well, that's Herson region. What's going on in other places? Now, anybody who's been reading Russian commentaries, and I stress strictly Russian commentaries, will have gained the impression from many of them that all of these attacks that Ukraine has launched in Herson region, in Kharkiv region, since the end of August, that they were all a feint, and that the real big concentration of Ukrainian forces was in Zaporozhye, the city of Zaporozhye, which is in the center. It's between Herson and Donbass, and that the Ukrainians would launch and advance from Zaporozhye towards Melitopol and ultimately the Black Sea coast, with the intention of severing the land bridge that the Russians have created between Russia via Donbass and Zaporozhye region to Crimea, and thence on to Herson region. And there's been massive speculation that that's always been the Ukrainian plan. It's been the Ukrainians have concentrated large forces in Zaporozhye, and they've been trying repeatedly to recapture the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. Attacks of that nature go on all the time. They're repeatedly repelled, but Ukraine seems to try again and again and again. Anyway, there's been reports that that was the real Ukrainian plan all along, that the attacks in Herson and the attacks in Kharkiv were intended to draw Russian troops away from Zaporozhye, opening the way for a Ukrainian offensive towards Melitopol and to sever the land bridge. Well, that offensive, if it was ever planned, has never happened. And I have to stress again that all reports, all discussions of it, which I have seen, are exclusively Russian. I've never found a single Ukrainian source that refers to any plan for such an offensive. It could all have been in the Russian imagination. Who knows? But anyway, it could be that there was such a plan, but if such a plan existed, the latest tentative indications are that it's been called off, that with the build-up of Russian forces, and the Russian Defense Minister Shoigu now says that 87,000 reservists have now joined the Russian military, massively reinforcing the Russian military in the conflict. The massing of Russian forces, the building up of these fortified lines that General Surovikin, the overall Russian commander, was talking about, that the Ukrainians have realized that such an offensive is now hopeless and that they've called it off, and that there's some indications that the Ukrainian forces in Zaporozhye are now moving towards a defensive posture. In other words, they're setting out to defend Zaporozhye, not to launch an offensive from it. That's what some of the reports are suggesting. Again, I don't know whether or not that is actually the case. But further east of Zaporozhye, there have been important developments. Yesterday, in my program, I spoke about the Russian advance on Vuhledar. The fact that the Russians have recaptured around half of the village of Pavlovka, which is right on the outskirts of Vuhledar, and that the Russians appear to be, or claiming that they have now brought the road from Vuhledar to the settlement of Marinka, which is one of the key settlements that the Ukrainian military created around Donetsk city, that road, that the Russians are now able to shell that road, that to use the expression that's used, the Russians have brought this road under their fire control. And there's also reports that the Russians are now advancing on another settlement near Vuhledar called Novo-Mikhailovka. And if all this is correct, it's been suggested that Vuhledar, which is, by the way, probably heavily fortified, it's a small town, 15,000 people before the start of the war, but it has, the usual Soviet-era high-rise buildings, which can be easily converted into fortresses. Anyway, it's probably heavily fortified, but of course, if it's defended, if it's surrounded, then its defense would not be practical anyway, because any Ukrainian troops trapped there would not be able to get supplies, and we would see a repeat of what happened in Mariupol in miniature. So the indications seem to be that the Russians are launching this offensive near Vuhledar, that they claiming that they've brought the road from Vuhledar to Marinka under their artillery control, and that they seem to be capturing more settlements and seem to be working towards surrounding Vuhledar, a smaller place, as I said, than some of the other places we've been hearing about. Now, all of this is happening at the same time as the Russians are claiming that they've made more inroads into the Ukrainian defenses, these massive defenses that the Ukrainians built up around Donetsk city, including in Marinka itself, which is the village or suburb of Donetsk city that is at the other end of the road from Vuhledar. So it's quite interesting, actually, that every time one expects the Russians to focus on Bakhmut, which is, one's always told, is the linchpin of Ukrainian defenses in Donbass, it turns out that the Russians' real focus, most of their actual energy seems to be instead focused on breaking Ukrainian defenses around Donetsk city. And I've discussed the political imperative behind that in earlier videos. But it seems we are getting closer now to the point where the Russians might be soon in a position to do that, to break the Ukrainian defenses in this area. Certainly, if Vuhledar falls, then Ukrainian positions near Donetsk begin to look highly vulnerable, and the danger that those Ukrainian troops might become encircled themselves starts to increase, or at least, again, so it seems to me. So this is an interesting development, and I would point out that it shows that even whilst weather conditions appear to have bogged the Ukrainians down in Herson region, the Russians seem to be able to continue advancing, despite presumably being exposed to the same weather conditions around Donetsk city and in Vuhledar. And that doesn't entirely surprise me. The Russian military is obviously better adapted to fighting on this terrain than probably any other military. It is, after all, or has been through most of their history, native to them. And of course, their armoured vehicles, unlike those supplied to the Ukraine by the West, are probably adapted to operating in these muddy conditions. Anyway, that's what seems to be happening there. Now, news from Bakhmut city itself. It's one of those days when I will say straight away, I haven't seen any. And as for further north still, in Kharkiv region, northern Donbass, the impression I get there is that the fighting is at a standstill, that various Ukrainian attempts to break through into northern Lugansk have all come to an end, have all failed, and that the Ukrainian offensive in that part of the front has ground to a total stop. So that's the information I've been getting about the situation on the battlefronts. And note that the Ukrainian offensive is now at a complete standstill, but the Russian offensive in various places, in Vuhledar, near Donetsk city, probably in Bakhmut as well, that offensive is still continuing. It's still grinding forward, grinding being the expression. General Surovikin in his interview, his TV interview 2 weeks ago, that was what he said he would do to the Ukrainian military. And that apparently is what he's doing. Now, the Russian news agency TASS has recently started adding up total Ukrainian losses on the basis of information provided by the Russian Ministry of Defense in its daily bulletins. These bulletins are fairly controversial, but TASS, and of course this is a Russian news agency, I want to repeat again, TASS is now claiming that there's been a sharp rise over the last week in Ukrainian losses. It says that announced losses, Ukrainian losses claimed by the Russian Defense Ministry are now running at 2,500 dead a week. Now, that's less high than has been true at some earlier points in the war. At one point, during the fighting in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, Ukraine admitted that 1,000 Ukrainian troops were dying every day. Well, TASS says, on the basis of Russian Defense Ministry information, that recently it's 2,500 every week. Let me repeat again, no military can sustain losses on this scale, at least no military on the scale of the Ukrainian military. The Ukrainian military really numbers 300,000 men, as I gather is the consensus figure. Then it cannot absorb losses at the rate of 2,500 a week. It's simply can't happen. It's impractical. One is talking about, 10,000 killed a month. And of course, at particular points in the war, it would be higher than that. That is a level of attrition that is hideous. And we see attrition working against Ukraine at every level. Economic, the missile attacks, destroying its infrastructure, and of course at the military level. I think, and I've said this many times, people got overexcited, some people got overexcited or overconcerned about the Ukrainian offensives in September and early October. I've increasingly come round to the view, eloquently expressed by people like Brian Beletic at the New Atlas, Douglas McGregor, Scott Ritter, that the overall effect of these offensives has been to hasten Ukraine's collapse, its military defeat. I'm not a military expert, as I again repeat, but it seems that to me that what Ukraine has achieved is nothing of any strategic significance. It has instead provoked the Russians into taking massive countermeasures with this missile offensive, with this call up of reservists, with this appointment of Surovikin, and the result, the overall effect, is that Ukraine has suffered very heavy, irreplaceable losses in both men and equipment, depleting its forces to a disastrous extent. Now, I've spoken many times about the imperative for Ukraine in this situation, faced by this situation, to seek peace. The Russians have repeatedly said that they're prepared to sit down and negotiate with Ukraine, even though the conditions will be tougher than the deal that was almost agreed back in March and which Ukraine was persuaded to walk away from by Boris Johnson and most probably the Biden administration. But surely it's better to sit down and talk and find out what the Russians might be willing to agree to than to engage in these catastrophes, to see more thousands of men killed every week, than to risk hyperinflation and risk scenarios where entire cities have to be evacuated. I mean, it is irresponsible to my mind for any government to take those kind of risks upon itself. Risks which won't affect directly Ukraine's leaders, but which will affect massively Ukraine's population, which one would suppose they're ultimately responsible for. And again, it is equally irresponsible and reckless of the Western powers not to be urging Ukraine to negotiations in this scenario. Well, I've talked about it multiple times. I'm not going to repeat myself. Apparently, the G20 summit is due to happen in Bali in a few weeks' time. The indications are that Vladimir Putin himself is intending to go. There's a possibility Zelensky could go too. The Russians are floating the idea that Putin might actually have a meeting with Biden to discuss a potential settlement of the conflict in Ukraine. And perhaps Zelensky ought to agree to meet Putin as well and also discuss with him a potential settlement of the conflict in Ukraine. Every day that fails to happen brings us closer to the point of no return. No return for Ukraine. And given how disastrous the situation is now looking for Ukraine, it was in the Ukrainian government itself, apparently, which said that the attacks on the energy system were catastrophic, then I would have thought that the imperative of sitting down and negotiate is now overwhelming. Anyway, I ought to say that unfortunately I don't expect those negotiations to take place, and I do want to touch briefly on one further issue. It seems that President Erdogan of Turkey is now busy trying to resurrect the grain deal. He wants to speak to Putin, and apparently there's going to be telephone calls between Erdogan, Putin, and Zelensky over the course of today. I will obviously have to update you about this. We'll see whether anything can be agreed over the next couple of hours. Putin gave a press conference yesterday after meeting with the leaders of Armenia and Azerbaijan, whom the Russians seem to be edging towards a peace treaty. Anyway, he gave a press conference in which he seemed to be suggesting that, as I said, well, he said, in fact, that Russia had suspended its own participation in the grain deal. He didn't say that it was cancelled utterly, what I said yesterday, and that does leave a possible door for some renegotiation of the grain deal to meet Russian concerns. We'll see whether that happens, and we'll see what Erdogan is able to achieve over the next couple of hours. And I'm going to touch on very, very briefly a story that's circulating all over the media at the moment, not just the independent media, but which is appearing now in the British media as well. If you remember, during the political crisis in London, whilst Liz Truss was Prime Minister, the British Defence Secretary Ben Wallace did a frantic dash to Washington, saying that there had been a breach of communications, Britain's communications with the United States. And I was baffled and incredulous about that story, and I wondered what the truth was. But we're now getting lots of information, and it's increasingly looking as if there was not just a breach, but multiple breaches. It seems that lots of members of the British government were busy sending messages and texts and emails and engaging in conversations via their mobile phones. And they were talking to each other and also to their American counterparts. And it seems that there's now reasons to believe that these mobile phones were being hacked by unknown third parties, though the concern must be that they were the Russians, and that Liz Truss in particular seems to have been a particularly bad case of somebody using their mobile phone in that kind of reckless way. And there's also reports that one particular text message was allegedly sent by Liz Truss whilst Prime Minister to the US Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, which some people construe as confirming Britain's involvement in the attack on the Nord Stream pipelines. Now, the first thing to say is that I think it is now overwhelmingly likely that this breach of communication security has actually happened. There's been no real denial of it from any British source. So it looks increasingly as if something like that did take place. About this email or text message from Liz Truss to Blinken, I'm much more sceptical. Let me say at the outset, I believe, in fact, I firmly believe that the United States was involved in the attack on the Nord Stream pipelines. I think it is highly likely, to coin a phrase, that the British were also. I think all the circumstantial evidence points in that kind of direction. But as for this text message or email, about that I am less sure. I've said on previous occasions, and let me repeat today, that one of the easiest traps to fall into is when evidence comes along which appears to corroborate your beliefs, your pre-existing beliefs, to assume that that evidence is true, and not look behind and test that evidence and subject it to the kind of rigor and consideration, careful consideration and skepticism that evidence of this kind of nature certainly requires. Now, because I happen to believe that the United States was the party that was probably behind the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines, and because I happen to believe that the British probably were involved in that sabotage, That doesn't mean that I'm assuming that this email or text message from Liz Truss is real. I have to say that this is all at the moment rumour, speculation. Provenance for me is very unclear. The fact that apparently iCloud was involved makes it even more unlikely to me. Anyway, until we get something a little bit more conclusive, perhaps some kind of admission from the British authorities, unlikely that is, I'm going to park this away. I'm not going to say it's necessarily untrue, but I'm not going to base any assessments on it. What I will say is this: if the Americans got wind of the fact that the British security systems had collapsed in the way that they had done, the British leaders were behaving in this reckless and irresponsible way with their mobile phones, then, knowing the Americans, they will have been beside themselves with anger. And Ben Wallace's trip to Washington starts to look like a dressing down. And I wonder whether that is what has actually been happening. And if there was a breach of security on the kind of scale that looks like may have been the case, well, that may support the claim that many people have made that the Americans, furious as they would no doubt be, might have had a hand in Liz Truss's fall. But all of this is so speculative at the moment that I'm not going to venture further and discuss it further. I think we just don't have enough information, and given the nature of what we have seen, it's quite likely that we won't have more information, at least for some time. Eventually, we will, I suspect, get the full story, though it may take years to come out. In the meantime, I think I've spoken for enough time. I've now exceeded an hour in this video, but there was a lot to cover. And I think that this is a good point to stop. As I said, more from me tomorrow. We'll see what Erdogan is up to, whether he's able to revive the grain deal, and if so, in what form. And we'll see whether the Russians continue with their missile offensive and continue to work their way round Vuhledar and in places like Marinka. Until then, that's enough from me. And just to remind you, if you want to watch all our videos, you can also find them on our other platforms: Locals, Rumble, ODYSEE, BitChute, Telegram, and of course we're now on Rokfin as well. And also, remember, you can support our work via PayPal and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, where you can buy the amazing things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and other great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Well, that's me for the day. More from me soon, and have a very good day. Until then.